It's always frustrating when a follow-up fails to learn anything from its predecessors. Sadly, the tendency to slip back into mediocrity is an affliction that torments all forms of media. The Simpsons spent 20 years regularly failing to understand what made its first 10 seasons so beloved. Of course, video games are just as guilty as their multimedia brethren in allowing once great franchises to fall into disrepute. Whether due to subpar writing, shoddy business practices, or keeping the bathwater instead of the baby, one thing these sequels all have in common is a complete lack of understanding about what made their previous entries tick. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game sequels that drastically missed the point. Number 10. XENOBLADE Chronicles 2. The first XENOBLADE Chronicles begins with thunderous intensity, launching the player into a pivotal role in a battle against an encroaching mechanoid army. XENOBLADE Chronicles 2 starts by having the player fight a crab on a boat. We'll give this to the developers, at least they know how to lower our expectations right off the bat. Those introductory fights end up being perfectly symbolic of the differences between the two games. The first game trusted that its players would be intelligent enough to pick up on the story and combat system in quick order, while the second assumed its players were total idiots who needed everything spoon-fed as slowly as possible. Abilities you start with in the original game aren't earned until about 15 hours into the sequel, which makes the opening hours a chore to wade through as you pop off the same abilities over and over again on low-level enemies, like a low-budget MMO. It was patronizing, boring, and immensely off-putting for fans. The developers got their act together in a big way for XENOBLADE Chronicles 3, but the middle game in the franchise is exactly that, mid. Number 9. Street Fighter V. It's telling that one of the most celebrated parts of Street Fighter VI is the modern controls feature, whereby gamers can pull off even the most complicated special move with nothing more than the flick of a stick and the press of a button. It shows that Capcom has finally understood that gating their seminal fighting series to nimble-fingered experts is a dead end, and that opening up the franchise to players of all levels is the way forward. Perhaps the underwhelming response to Street Fighter V played a part in that. To understand why Street Fighter V was such a letdown, you need to look back at its predecessor. Street Fighter IV was celebrated for its back-to-basics approach, bringing in fans old and new after the intimidatingly technical Street Fighter III scared them away. Unfortunately, Capcom's response to this success was akin to a maths teacher introducing students to calculus straight after they'd learned long division. Street Fighter V went back to the demanding route of the threequel, only now with even more meters to juggle and mechanics to memorize. Having just brought lapsed fans back into the fold with the relatively laid-back fourth entry, Capcom scared them away again with Street Fighter V's focus on technical proficiency. Number 8. Sonic Lost World. Sonic team head honcho Takashi Iizuka recently promised Sonic fans that future games in the franchise would adhere to the blueprint laid out by the wildly successful Sonic Frontiers. Hopefully the man wasn't just blowing smoke, as the Sonic franchise has a history of failing to realize when it's onto a good thing. Case in point, Sonic Lost World. Lost World's predecessor, Sonic Generations, felt like a new dawn for the blue blur. Blending the 2D platforming of old with the most refined 3D gameplay the series had seen yet, Generations was the best Sonic game since the Mega Drive days, and felt like the future of the franchise. Unfortunately, what felt like a new beginning turned out to be a false start, as Sega followed up the best Sonic game in decades with one of the worst. For reasons no one has yet been able to fathom, Sega debuted an entirely new control scheme in Lost World that made gaming's most famous speedster control like a shopping trolley. Sega undid all the goodwill built up by Generations in a single stroke, and the next game in the series, Sonic Forces, was even worse. Frontiers may have got Sonic back on track, but whether or not he'll stay there is in Sega's hands. Number 7. Hitman Absolution. Expectations are a funny thing. Hitman Absolution has the reputation of being the worst game in the franchise, but if it was your first Hitman game, you'd wonder what the problem was. Yes, it's forehead-smackingly tone-deaf at times. If you played it, the words BDSM nuns will have automatically sprung to mind, but as far as linear stealth games go, it's actually one of the better ones of the PS3, Xbox 360 era. Absolution's biggest problem was that the previous entry in the franchise, Hitman Blood Money, was the perfect distillation of the Hitman formula. Blood Money gave players large open-ended maps to play in, and a variety of tools with which to accomplish their brutal work. Absolution's shift to linear A to B levels was seen as a huge step back for the franchise, and effectively garroted the fanbase's faith in the series. Fortunately, the developers won fans back with the exquisite reboot trilogy, proving that not every misstep need be as fatal as stepping under a chandelier when a suspiciously tall, bald and tattooed janitor is standing next to the release switch. Number 6. Tekken 6. For all of Street Fighter V's sins, at least it had the focus on the one-on-one brawling that made the series famous. Tekken 6, on the other hand, decided to turn Namco's legendary fighter into an abysmal Streets of Rage ripoff. Alright, that's not strictly true. There was a more traditional arcade mode, but it was clear that the majority of Namco's focus had been spent on Tekken 6's scenario campaign, a horrendously dull action game that saw Tekken's iconic characters wade through a badly designed, ill-thought-out experience that unsuccessfully attempted to transplant Tekken's one-on-one combat into a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The frustrating thing is, Namco knew this was a bad idea. They'd already tried and failed with the idea in Tekken 5's Devil Within, an action-adventure so diabolical that its 3-hour campaign induced more despair than the entire Last of Us saga. Tekken had never worked as anything other than a one-on-one fighting game, and Namco's insistence on doubling down on the series' biggest misstep ensured Tekken 6 would forever be remembered as the franchise's low point. Number 5. Quake 4. WhatCulture Gaming previously did a list on the 10 best number 4s in gaming history. In the introduction, it was joked that the only way Quake 4 would have made the list is if the title was changed to 10 sequels that learned absolutely nothing from the prequel. One self-fulfilling prophecy later, and here we are. As to how Quake 4 made its way onto this particular list, it's pretty straightforward. After id made Quake 3 one of the best multiplayer games of all time, they farmed development of the sequel over to Raven Software. Raven inexplicably decided to shift the focus back to single player, resulting in an aggressively average FPS that has almost completely slipped from public memory. The only reason people remember Quake 4 nowadays is because of the scene where your character is turned into a cyborg monstrosity while fully conscious. It's a brutal, visceral moment, made all the more remarkable by the 10 hours of utter mundanity surrounding it. Beyond this one moment, Quake 4 offers nothing of note throughout the duration of its campaign, and its very existence feels like a pointed reply to those of us who complained about Quake 3's lack of traditional single-player campaign, so be careful what we wish for, I guess. Number 4. Doom Eternal. Now, Doom Eternal may not be a bad game, but there's no doubt that it lost a lot of its predecessor's spark. Doom Eternal was a sequel to the 2016 Doom reboot, and while it was an improvement in many ways, like better graphics, new weapons, and a sweet grappling hook, Eternal sadly jettisoned the sense of playfulness that made the reboot such a joy to play. One of the defining features of Doom 2016 was its defiant middle finger to its own plot. Doomguy, the protagonist of the series, tore through the game like a chainsaw through demon flesh, making his intentions clear in the opening minutes when he punches through a terminal before it can finish its exposition dump. Action first, plot almost never. The sequel unfortunately shifted the balance too far in the favor of the latter. Eternal saw the series become infatuated with its pointlessly dense lore, casting Doomguy as some quasi-messianic entity locked in an eternal battle with the forces of hell. The shift in tone really didn't work, and ensured Eternal felt markedly less fun than Doom 2016. Number 3. Dead Space 3. Spurred on by the success of the recent Dead Space remake, EA has been openly discussing the possibility of remaking the other 2 entries in the trilogy. It's a tricky proposition, as while Dead Space 2 was arguably the best game in the series, Dead Space 3 was a franchise-killing disaster. Strong words, but justifiable ones. As well as introducing microtransactions to the series, so if you're scared, you can now pay the horror away, the introduction of co-op and focus on balls-to-the-wall action meant that the series lost all semblance of its identity as a survival horror game. Dead Space 2 walked the line between action and horror with aplomb, but EA's desperation to reach a more casual audience stripped the series of its identity, and ensured that Dead Space 3 ended the series in the most disappointing way possible. A bland mixture of zombie shooting tedium whose sole memorable moment was the utter stupidity of its ending. Number 2. Kingdom Hearts 3. Once again, we find ourselves reiterating the statement that a game doesn't have to be bad to be disappointing. The third entry in Square Enix's Disney/Final Fantasy mashup was a fine 8 out of 10 action RPG with plenty of fan service for followers of the house that Mickey built. Woody, Elsa, Mike Wazowski. Unfortunately, if you came into the game as a Final Fantasy fan, you were fresh out of luck. Kingdom Hearts had built its identity on bringing together the worlds of Disney and Final Fantasy to great success. Who could forget fighting Hades alongside FF10's Auron, taking on a literal army alongside Squall and Cloud, or fighting Sephiroth alongside Donald and Goofy? Well, apparently Square Enix forgot, as Kingdom Hearts 3 removed all traces of Final Fantasy from the story. Series producer Tetsuya Nomura has since stated that he wanted to put the focus on Kingdom Hearts' original cast rather than Final Fantasies, perhaps not realizing that Kingdom Hearts' increasingly bloated mythology is something players tolerate rather than enjoy. Kingdom Hearts is at its best when it mashes Final Fantasy and Disney characters together like an overexcited kid playing with all their action figures at once, and hopefully the upcoming Kingdom Hearts 4 recaptures some of that giddy magic. Number 1. Resident Evil Village. Let's play Spot the Difference. The first 2/3 of Resident Evil 7 are a slow-burning triumph of skin-crawling horror, marred by a final act filled with samey combat and dull boss fights. The first 2/3 of Resident Evil 8 are a slow-burning triumph of skin-crawling horror, marred by a final act filled with samey combat and dull boss fights. It's almost impressive how willfully ignorant Capcom was of Resi 7's failings when they designed the sequel. It's one thing to make a bad sequel, but following up with a product that makes exactly the same mistakes as the original is baffling. Not only that, but the ludicrously overblown section where you play as Chris Redfield, imagine a supernatural Call of Duty, showed that Capcom had also forgotten how much people hated the equally over-the-top Resi 6. Failing to learn from one prequel is bad enough, but failing to learn from two looks like you're actively trying to drive your franchise off a cliff. Here's hoping the inevitable Resident Evil 9 manages to refrain from indulging in the Fraser Crane school of game design where more is more. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other video game sequels that drastically miss the point. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.